The other primary industry is connected to the aforementioned Pearl Harbor lease that began in the 19th century. After the Japanese attack on the harbour, the US military presence dramatically increased. The threat drove nationalistic interests to unilaterally expand their operations in the Pacific. Hawaii now receives an annual contribution of $8.8 billion, or $14.7 billion if one accounts for indirect impacts, contributing to some civilian employment, creating about 102,000 jobs for residents, along with 64,000 plus active and inactive duty personnel scattered across the islands. All of these people consume local goods and services with the money that is sent to them by the federal government, turning this into an indirect form of federal assistance. This collaboration, whether they really like it or not, contributes to 8.9% of Hawaii's GDP. But there are a number of additional hang-ups, including the military's occupation of more than 5% of the state's inhabitable terrain, land that is in very high demand elsewhere. Then there's the industry of agriculture, the oldest source of profit in Hawaii, supplying pineapples, macadamia nuts, sugar, coffee and milk. Although still a major part of the Hawaiian economy, it's far from what it was 100 years ago. The tourism boom made the state's land so valuable that it was more profitable to sell it to build housing or a resort than it was to work it for agriculture. This in turn made the state even more dependent on tourism, as it now needed to import a majority of its food. In fact, like the fishing crisis, Hawaii now spends $3 billion plus annually to import 90% of the food it once independently produced just 50 years ago. It has also contributed to the state's most immediate problem, living costs. But that issue is so large it needs to be addressed separately. Either way, these components provide the Hawaiian government with much of its current wealth. But there's one underlying interest that plays a role in all of Hawaii's industries, big and small. One that consistently challenges its people's quality of life to bring profit to a select few: land. The largest economic boom as of late, the one that presents the largest challenge for the Hawaiian people, is real estate, and the rising living costs that come with it. Affordability in Hawaii is amongst the worst in the developed world, and this partially has to do with how the land itself is formed. To begin with, Hawaii itself is bigger than most people expect, but it's very spread out and usable land is very limited. The size of the islands alone are significant, but this doesn't account for the terrain. While the main body of the US is mostly comprised of flat land and hills, almost all of Hawaiian islands are virtually uninhabitable. Its steep rocky elevation doesn't really make for a land ripe for settling. Because of this, most of the Hawaiian population resides on Oahu, while only a fraction of it is settled on its neighbouring islands. Big Island, for example, only had a 2020 census reported population of 200,629 people. Compared to the 1 million people on Oahu, it becomes apparent that scarcity is a serious problem for lifelong residents. On the flip side, this scarcity has attracted some of the wealthiest people on the planet, which isn't necessarily a good thing for 99% of its residents. There are major headlines dating back to 1994, with entrepreneurs like Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle, leasing a bulk of the island of Lanai, only to later buy 98% of it in 2012. Then there's media personality Oprah Winfrey, who has purchased over 2,000 acres on her Maui ranch, which she likes to call the Promised Land. Just 37 billionaires, a number that can fill a small classroom, including Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, own 5.3% of the state's total land. 11.1% if one removes property owned by the government, and almost half of what can be reasonably inhabited. It's a bit silly to assume that the acquisitions will cease. There have been numerous reports from small landowners getting offers from many of the figures on this list. For a while, this land crisis came in and out of the public line of sight, but this changed when wind-driven wildfires in the islands of Maui destroyed more than 2,200 structures and caused about $5.5 billion in damages. With the devastating loss of sacred landmarks as well as 2,000 homes displacing 5,000 people, suddenly the economic challenges Hawaiians face were all that anybody could talk about, and as previously stated, there are many of them. For higher income individuals and families, affordability has euphemistically been called the cost or price of paradise. But for the average Hawaiian, this seems like a cruel joke rather than a harmless expression. According to a study by the Missouri Economic Research and Information Center in 2019, Hawaii was reported to have the highest cost of living in the nation with an index of 191.8. The national average index is set to 100, and Hawaii crushed it, with the closest second being the District of Columbia at an index of 159. For perspective, the island of Honolulu requires a $200,000 annual income to live comfortably, but in reality, the average household income is only $80,000. Looking back at Oahu, the most populated of the 7 islands, not including the Forbidden Island, $93,000 is considered low income, making the cost of living 88% higher than the national average. And even with an income that many would consider to be enough to support a decent lifestyle, which it fails to do, most will never be able to buy a home. For every other housing crisis found in the US, just go ahead and double, triple, or quadruple the number in mind, because the average sales price of the home in Hawaii keeps going up. By 2023, this average sales price reached $970,000. These are pretty troubling statistics for a majority of Hawaiians who are often working multiple jobs just to end up sleeping in their own rundown cars. But to make matters worse, being in such a remote location in the Pacific, the problems compound with other living costs like power and groceries. A staple as simple as milk can cost $10. This leads to the next obstacle Hawaii deals with in contrast to mainland US states: income. In centres like New York, San Francisco, London, or even Sydney, it may not be a perfect system, but incomes are higher in accordance with local living costs. Hawaii, however, marches to a different tune. Most of its population work in relatively basic jobs, and there are very few high-paying jobs. For quick clarification, keeping the listed low income in mind, the median income for Hawaiian residents is $41,850, less than half the minimum most analysts say is required for basic needs. To make